Welcome, everyone, to what we hope will prove to be an informative and insightful discussion about mitigating cyber risks and some of the best approaches you can take to that end. I'm Rocky Merchandani, anchor and contributing editor at The Trust, the custom content studio and creative consultancy at the Wall Street Journal and Barron's Group. A couple of housekeeping notes before we begin. First, we really want you to participate in these conversations, and we have two ways for you to do that. First, we'll certainly be taking questions from you, which you can submit in the box below your video player. And second, we'll also have an audience poll, a couple of poll questions a bit later during the conversation. To view and to add your reply to the poll questions, you're going to toggle to the poll tab in the questions box. We're going to cover as many audience questions as we can in about the last 15 minutes or so of the session. In the meantime, you should feel free to connect with fellow attendees in the chat panel to the right. And if you encounter any difficulties, please take a look at our tech tips by clicking the small question mark on the top right of the site. I'm thrilled to be joined by Ari Schwartz. And before we kick off our conversation with him, I'll give you a bit of a brief bio for context. These days, Ari oversees cybersecurity services for the Cybersecurity Risk Management Group at Venable LLP, where he has guided the establishment of the firm's cybersecurity consulting services. Prior to joining Venable, Ari was a member of the White House National Security Council, where he served as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Cybersecurity. Welcome, Ari.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me, Rocky.
I'm thrilled for this conversation. We don't have much time, so I want to hop right in. Ari, cyber risk mitigation really isn't the first practice area that maybe comes to mind when folks think of law firms. Can you tell us why it's so important at Venable?
Well, so Venable has had one of the oldest and largest privacy legal practices in the world. And they saw very early on, especially as data breach laws were passing and the liability for organizations was increasing, that working with cyber risk firms was important. At first, they partnered with consultancies, but then it's about 6-7 years ago when I left government, they brought me in-house to try and build a team that could do it internally. And today we have a team of 20 non-legal professionals working together. Some of them are the best known experts in the world on different pieces of this. And we help to do both the kind of operational piece of helping people as well as the policy side.
When you talk about the operational piece and also the policy side, I'm curious about the foundational elements. So can you tell me a little bit about sort of what are the foundational elements of good cyber risk mitigation today?
Well, a lot of this has to do with knowing how to measure, how to manage, and make sure that you have the adequate resources you need to deal with these pieces, right? So, too often I've been in situations where I've heard cyber professionals say, we've got it under control to their leadership. And in today's world, that's never the right answer. No one has it totally under control. Right? Cyber risk mitigation means involving your leadership in these discussions and then getting to that point of knowing how to grow with it, how to take the journey to the point where you are addressing these issues.
I think you're absolutely right about not having it under control, and that idea of that's a great point. I want to talk a little bit about the cybersecurity framework that you've developed as a planning tool for your clients, Ari. Can you talk us through sort of the core components?
Yeah, well, actually, it was built at NIST. Originally, the cybersecurity framework was created in 2012. It came out of an executive order that President Obama put together. And really, the goal of it was to create the Rosetta Stone for cybersecurity risk management, right? The different sectors use different terminology and different standards for their cybersecurity controls. And the framework is really made to tie them together under a set of functions, right? And those are identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And it allows organizations to create baselines, to create measurements, et cetera, across these functions tied to the control set, and then be able to tie that across different sectors so that different people coming in know exactly what those terms mean, even if it ties into a specific set within that company or within that sector. So that has really helped to turn cyber risk management from a kind of sector by sector discipline into something that works across industry. And I think it's actually helped to increase the ability of regulators, of national security experts also to understand what is going on in different companies and different sectors.
Ari, what kind of advice do you have for C-suite folks really trying to reach that next level of security for their enterprises?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing is understanding where the greatest risk is. We often go into companies and there's a fixation from the board or from someone in the C-suite on one particular issue that they've heard about from some other company or that happened at their last company. Instead of trying to get a real feel for where is the liability for this company, where's the greatest risk for this company, what visibility do they have into what's happening in the organization, is it improving over time? Those kinds of questions I think are the ones that we want to see, and it's really about the C-suite asking the right questions and having an understanding of what's going on.
And when you say asking the right questions, Ari, do you mind just taking a second and kind of, I wanted to stay there for a second. What do you mean by that? Like asking for the right questions? What kind of questions are we're talking about?
Well, and so a lot of times when we're working with a board, you'll want to have truly a dashboard for them or for the leadership, a dashboard where they set where when you're doing cyber risk management, you have a set of areas that you want to focus on for the year or over a certain period of time. And you show progress over that period of time, right? And you have the kind of insight, the visibility into those different areas so that you can demonstrate that you've improved in those areas. And then at the end of the year, you look at it again, right? It's a journey, as I was saying, right? It's not something that you, and management is like, knows about this from financial issues, right? They deal with the same type of risk management for financial issues all the time. Just when you start to talk to them about technical issues, their eyes glaze over. So you have to put it in the same type of way that they can understand it and where they get engaged in the issue, and getting to the point of having them understand that.
And there's accountability there too. So thank you for that. I want to pause quickly for our first poll question for the audience. So just again, as a refresher to answer, you're going to toggle to that poll tab in the questions box. So for our first question, how important is security and performance integration to your organization? Is it very important, not a priority, but should be, or not important to us? So go ahead and answer that. We'll give you a minute or so to answer it, and I'll be back to you with the results. But in the meantime, Ari, you talked about visibility a couple of times. How does visibility fit into cyber risk mitigation? And do complex organizations have the visibility they need to really be able to reliably detect, understand, and then address threats?
Yeah, so in the macro sense, it's exactly what I've been talking about, which is that that leadership knows how to measure risk and make decisions, right? That's what I mean by visibility in that sense. But there's also the visibility in the micro sense, right? And this is really where we get into some of the nitty gritty here into, what does normal look like in your systems? What is it on your network, on your corporate devices? If you don't have that kind of visibility, you can't really do the kind of measurement that you need to get at this information. And historically, we've done that through logs, through endpoint detection, EDR, through network detection, NDR. But as we move to more traffic being encrypted and move to more information being in the cloud and the spread of devices, right, through IoT and eventually 5G, it's becoming a lot more complicated to keep track of this. And that's one of the reasons you hear a lot more about XDR right now, which is, trying to solve this problem by pulling together the wider range of telemetry across the board and see into some of these areas.
Our poll results are coming in. It looks like about 90% of you say that that it's very important. About 9% say it's not a priority, and about 1% say it's not important. So that's our first result. It does fall well in line with what you're saying, Ari. I want to ask you a little bit about security and performance. Where does security and performance come together in good cyber risk mitigation, in your opinion? And where have you seen recent innovations in this space?
Yeah, one thing I like to talk about is it used to be you see these poll questions like, what's more important, performance or security or privacy? And people would have to pick one, right? But in reality, that's not where we are today, right? You have to do all of them at the same time. And I think one of the things that we're seeing from some new tools in this space is that they're aimed at monitoring packet data, being able to demonstrate that you can do both performance, that to help with performance. At the same time, you can also see what type of information is being shared there. And in the enterprise cloud in particular, right, this is the key way to ensure that things are going right. Like you can really get a sense of what's happening behind the scenes in a way that you can with other tools.
Are you also coordinate the Cybersecurity Coalition? And I'd like to ask you a little bit to talk about that and how open are your member companies to collaborating, right? About security, about policy, about expertise. And maybe you could talk also a little bit about sort of the good things or highlights that have come out of that coalition.
Yeah, so the coalition, I think, is the policy side of what I was talking about before, about that we do the operational side and the policy side. And so it's a group of cybersecurity companies and tech companies that have cybersecurity units that we've worked together with over time to improve cybersecurity. And when I was in the White House, we have so many trade associations come to us and they tell me why something was good for them or bad for them. With my focus being national security, no one came to us just to talk about security, right? And the goal of the Cybersecurity Coalition is to get the real security experts together and come and talk about what is good for security as well as what's good for business and where there's overlap. And we can have open conversations with people and explain that in a way where they don't feel as though we're just saying that because that's what's good for business, but what is good for security is good for these companies' business as well. So it's a key point there. And we do see competitors work together very well. I mean, the best example the one I like to come back to, because it was one of the first things that we did, and it really shows what makes us different, is you've had so many, when NAFTA was being renegotiated, right? You had this new USMCA being discussed, and the tech trade associations had a list of 12 things that they wanted, and number 10 on the list was cybersecurity cooperation across Mexico and Canada and the US. And we said, we're going to go in and that's all we're going to talk about. And it's one of the things that got done, right? All of that list of 12 things, maybe 2 or 3 of them got done. Number 10 on the list got done because we were the ones making it the only thing we cared about. And there was no disagreement from Mexico or Canada with what the US wanted to do and what we wanted to do. So it was very easy to get through, but someone needed to focus on it and demonstrate that it was good for business and for security at the same time.
I love that example that you just shared. Are you able to kind of pull out maybe a couple other examples of successes that the coalition has had or the way folks work together? That's so interesting.
Yeah, so I think, one thing that we did early on, actually, as well, and that has become kind of more commonplace. We were talking about the NIST cybersecurity framework before, and under the NIST cybersecurity framework, they create these profiles, and most of the profiles, when the framework was created, were focused on specifically on sectors, right? So you have a telecommunications sector one. You have an energy sector one. You have even like the hospitals, hotels, hospitality has one, right? So you have these different sectors that have their profiles. But what we did was we tried to do a cross-cut. Working with NIST, we did a cross-cut for botnets and for other types of threats. And now that has become very commonplace too. And what that means is if you're a company that cares about a ransomware, for example, and you take the ransomware threat profile, you can take that and then take your industry sector and you can focus on the specific controls for your sector. So that's a good example of, when people say, well, we're not only concerned about this sector, but we're also concerned about this specific type of threat, how to go about doing it. And the coalition was the one that kind of put that idea together and made it happen. And now it's commonplace that people do that as well. So that's an example of something that's sort of outside of the Washington sphere that shows kind of how we're getting companies to work together on policy can address some of these issues.
Thank you. I want to ask another poll question to the audience. Do you feel that you have enough visibility, the visibility you need to detect, understand, and address threats across your digital ecosystem? Yes? mostly, not enough, or not at all. And Ari, once we get those results, I'm going to ask you, based on them, sort of what folks can do about that. So I'll give folks a second to answer that. In the meantime, Ari, what do you think the current intelligence tends to point to certain segments, right? Like healthcare as having particularly penetrable cyber defense. Why do you think that is? And really, what could these segments be doing better to mitigate cyber risk?
Yeah, so I mean, the White House has emphasized like healthcare, particularly hospitals, the water sector, K-12 as being schools being as major concerns, and I mean, a lot of that comes from the attacks we've seen, particularly ransomware, and efforts to kind of pick them off. So I can't disagree with what the government's choices are on that list. I think people are moving in the right direction. It comes back. You were talking about risk management before, and it comes back to risk management. It's slightly different in different sectors, but we do see, and also as we were talking about, this issue in hospitals. You're bringing a lot more devices in there. You're networking a lot more. They're more reliant on the technology, which they hadn't been in the past, and so with that comes the threats. And you have to, at the same time, you're ramping up the use of it. I mean, this audience knows that would be on listening to this knows that with that luxury of using more devices, getting more network, you get more information. You also have more security threats, and you have to invest in them in the right way. For too long, larger enterprises have not. We're not really investing in the space. They've started investing more now, but some of these sectors still have a long way to go.
You mentioned some of the other sectors, and I want to ask you, are there other sort of like world can't live without segments that are behind the curve? And are there some that you think are ahead of the curve?
Yeah, so I think, the education in general has been behind the curve. In the K-12 schools, it's because people haven't really put money toward it. In higher education, it's because it's a very difficult challenge because you want to have open campuses, but at the same time, you have threats all over the place. We know in water that in some of the large institutions, like it's all over the place in terms of in the U.S., that whether it's a large company or it's a small company involved, we often look at other countries and see what they're doing that so well. I was in Israel not so long ago, and I kind of asked this question, like, what do you do if you see something with the water sector and you have a problem there? And the guy says, like, well, I call my friend Duddy, who I was in the army with, and he fixes it, right? We don't have that luxury in the U.S. We don't have someone in each of these water facilities. Some of them are very tiny, some of them are enormous. So the more you have sectors like that, where there's not where you have different types of organizations and they're disparate all over the place, the harder it is to protect. And I think, especially when the regulatory structure is not centralized like that. But the banks, in terms of who does well, the banks do well. Governments are a little bit mixed. I think the federal government has done better recently, and state governments have started to do better. Local governments have done worse, we've seen. So
I love that example about the water in Israel. Thanks for that. I want to go back to our poll question, Ari. So we asked, do you have the visibility you need to detect, understand, and address threats across your digital ecosystem? And 15% of folks are saying yes, 43% are saying mostly, 39% say not enough, and 3% say not at all. And so, Ari, I want to ask you, for folks who are saying not enough or not at all, what are things that they might be able to do to improve that in their organization?
Yeah, I think the key is doing the convincing, right? So it is making the presentation in the right way that demonstrates the risk. I mean, some of that is measuring yourself against other organizations. I think a lot of times people have felt as though we don't have baselines for certain sectors, and that makes it really hard. As you can get together and have discussions with other people in your profession and kind of, work to try and create anonymous baselines, which some sectors are doing. I've been talking to MIT quite a bit about this because that's something they're focused on, is how to get this information across the board to people so that you're not giving away the state secrets for one particular company, but at the same time sharing that information and getting the baseline out of it, right? So that the more we can do that kind of work, the easier it is going to be to kind of make the case, we need more information. Some trade associations are doing that. The ISACs and the ISOWs, the information sharing organizations, are key to starting to do that as well. So I would suggest joining those, having conversations with them for your sector or area and region, because some of the ISOWs are regional, and trying to get that information so that you can make the case better. I also think, as I said about dashboards, being able to kind of really play out how this looks for leadership in terms of making it easier for them to understand where you need to get to, and then the resources you might need to get there.
We've heard before that sometimes making those convincing arguments can be difficult, right, in organizations. So I think that the dashboards and keeping folks accountable is a great idea, and also comparing, right, to other folks in your sector and other companies and how other folks are faring. Ari, in your experience, do cyber criminals sort of avoid enterprises that have superior security in place? What do you think?
Well, I mean, they're really criminals in particular, right, are looking for weaknesses. They're knocking on every door. They have a specific way of entry that they're looking for at that particular time. They might be looking at a specific sector where they know that weakness is more prevalent, and they're going to knock on doors. But if they knock on doors, if the control is in place to stop them, they move on, right? We know that. But the difference is, this is the difference between state actors and why we talk about persistent threats sometimes, because the state actors are different. Like they try lots of different means to get in. They stick with it. They work on a 9-to-5 schedule until they get in, right? Whereas the cyber criminals are working basically around the clock and trying to just look for particular weaknesses. So if you have the right controls in place, you can get past the cyber criminals, whereas it's harder to do that against state actors.
Is it possible to assess sort of how cyber criminals or state actors assess sort of like the risk reward when it comes to their own efforts? Or is their thinking kind of a black box?
Yeah, it's definitely possible to do that. And I mean, on the state actor side, you have intelligence communities around the world doing that all the time against each other. So we know that's done. On the criminal side, I mean, you see a lot of that from the different security companies that have their investigations that they do and the reports that they put out. So we do see focus on particular criminal gangs. Someone like Krebs on security, Brian Krebs does a great job in terms of focusing on specific actor sets and kind of highlighting, what their techniques are, what their tactics are, what they're getting out of it, why they're doing it, which I think helps people to understand why they might want to prioritize controls, right? A lot of times we focus a lot, maybe too much, on attribution, who is doing this, rather than the control it takes to stop them. But sometimes that attribution helps us to figure out which control it is we need to use. So, I think that getting the right control is the most important piece of it. If getting the attribution and the analysis behind it gets you to getting that control in place, particularly for cyber criminals, then we need to do that.
Ari, is there value for enterprises in understanding the motivations of these cyber criminals, and should they allocate resources in this particular direction?
Yeah, so I think larger enterprises have been doing a better job of that, and that's sort of what I was getting at the end of that. Was like, I had a federal regulator say to me not so long ago that it used to be when they would try to go after companies for not doing great security, it was very easy for them to do because they weren't doing anything. And now they just make consistently the wrong choices, right? So, and if companies continue to spend money on the wrong thing, then that's where the problem is more today. So, that's especially true, I think, for the large companies. So if we can get the large companies to kind of think a little bit more and be creative in this space and demonstrate that they're solving the problems that they've had in the past, I think number one. So they learn from their mistakes, I think, is a key point here, but also that they're looking at to the next trend. And part of that means working together in things like ISACs and we work very closely with the Health ISAC, for example. They do a great job of sharing that kind of information, of doing exercises with a lot of the health companies. We just need more people to do it.
So big picture, Ari, how do you think the world's sort of largest enterprises, right? How can they stay secure as their operations and their ecosystems become more complex?
Yeah, it's staying up to date on the controls, right? Making sure that you have the latest technologies that address these issues as we move more into the cloud, as we move, that you keep that kind of visibility that you've had in the past, in the macro and micro sense that I was talking about before. And it's also that your leadership is engaged with you, that the leadership understands where your problems are, and that you can demonstrate growth to them, continued growth, and in terms of mitigating the risks.
Ari, you have a perspective that many don't have because you've worked right inside the heart of the US government in a security role. What's sort of the role of legislation or regulation, requirements or obligations in kind of encouraging or forcing larger enterprises to stay up to date on those controls that you were just talking about?
Yeah, so I think that regulation has become much more of an issue as time's gone on. We know where the problems are. We know different sectors have these kind of, as I said, the profiles. The regulators have been learning, what works and what doesn't work, and what companies have been doing in this space. They know when someone's behind. So it's, I think the key part of regulation is not necessarily to push everyone to the point where there's no problems anymore. It's pushing people to do the minimum, right? That's really the key. You got to raise all boats to a certain point to make it harder for the bad guys to be able to do stuff. That's not going to stop everything, right? This is an ongoing journey. Risk management in this space, like we continue to do financial risk management, even though we have regulation, all sorts of regulations for financial risk. But that you got to make sure that you have the right controls in place in both areas. So and the reason I keep comparing back to financial risk is because we know that that's what leadership understands, right? And so that when they talk about risk management, that's their kind of number one thought. Maybe for general counsels, it's legal liability, et cetera. But in general, everyone sort of understands the risk that comes in that space. In some sectors, if I'm talking to a retailer, I'll talk to them about in terms of the weather, right? The weather, you can do a maximum job, the maximum available job, and you still might get hit by the weather. But the question is, what did you put in place, and what did you do to take action in this space to do the best that you could there? Because a lot of times it's not going to raise to that level, and you're going to be ready. And that's the same thing here. You need to get to the point where we need to get everyone to the point. The regulators need to get everyone to the point where we're at that minimum level. We're hearing a lot more about regulation. The White House is putting out the national cyber strategy as soon as. It's going to be, I think it's going to come out sometime in the next month and sometime in February. And at that time, it's going to talk number one on the list for that strategy. I've seen a copy of it, is regulation in this space. It's focused on the sectors that haven't had regulation, but it does, I think, get the point across. We've passed the point here where people have had time to ramp up, right? We are at the point where everyone should be at that minimum level. And so we are seeing sectors move into that, have sectors take up regulation in this space that haven't before. That's not to say, again, that the regulation should be so high that it's that people can't meet it with normal means. We should have the regulation to do the minimum that people that should be expected of companies, and then over time we can raise that.
Ari, we're sitting here in the US, but cyber criminals we know operate globally, and security is a global issue. So what about sort of regional inconsistencies in terms of these regulations? Does that sort of help raise all the boats, as you said, and help meet those minimum levels?
It does. I also think, I mean, one thing that we're seeing is that the EU is acting faster than the US is. They have this new cyber regulations act that they are putting together now that will, over time, become an international standard in this space, likely because countries like the US don't have something that works across all the different sectors. And it's going to, just like they did with GDPR for privacy, you're going to see the EU act in this space as soon as this year. That means it doesn't go into effect for several years, the way we saw GDPR coming down the road. But I think you'll see other countries react to the EU in a lot of ways more than they'll act to the US. So that becomes a very important legislative action for the next year, and one that the Cybersecurity Coalition is working on very closely. I'm going to Brussels next week, and I know a lot of people are following this very closely and want to make sure that it's done in a way that works for companies and is not going to be so burdensome that you end up with a lot of the problems we had early on with GDPR. So you get to the point where security improves, but it's something that people can handle.
Ari, I want to ask you one last question. If there was one message, or maybe a couple of messages from today, you've made a lot of great points in this conversation that you'd like people to really kind of take away, what would that be?
I'd go back to, we talked about the NIST cybersecurity framework. They're putting out a new version of it, but I think people can stick with the old version right now and look at what they're doing, tie it to that, figure out how to measure best for them under the framework, demonstrate that over time, and then, no matter who comes in and says, well, we need you to do something that maps to this, the framework can be used to map to that. So that's really like the number one point that I have for people on this side. Those controls, obviously, there's new technologies for those controls each individually, but you got to figure out what you need first doing risk management before you figure out what those technologies and tools are that you want to map in there to get to that kind of visibility I was talking about before.
Thank you, Ari. I've enjoyed our conversation. I've really enjoyed your answers to these questions, and I know that our audience is going to have a lot of questions for you later, and we'll get to those shortly. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Rocky.
Of course. I want to ask one last poll question. Is your organization more proactive or more reactive when it comes to managing cyber risk? Is it proactive, reactive, or are you not sure? So if you can go ahead and answer that poll question, I'd appreciate it. And now I'm going to turn to Thor Wallace, the CIO at NETSCOUT, for what we're going to call our rapid fire round, focused on establishing best practices. Welcome, Thor.
Hi, how are you?
I'm wonderful. It's so great to be here with you today. We've had a great conversation with Ari, and I'm excited for our chat.
Yeah, I know. I've been listening and it's been good. Thank you.
Of course. Thor, in your role as CIO at NETSCOUT, how do you deal with the constant risk of a cyber attack? And what have you done in recent years to help mitigate that risk?
Yeah, I mean, it's a constant kind of question that we're always grappling with. The way I think about it is, a lot of the points that Ari was making was, make it risk-based. And when we think about risk, we think about it both external, not letting people in, but also internal. And I'll kind of talk a little bit about each of those. I mean, I think from a trajectory standpoint, looking back to your question, kind of historically, we've been very focused and have done a lot of heavy lifting on the external side. And we've taken some of those practices and brought them inside to harden the inside of us. So let me talk a little bit about what we've done in the past around hardening the edge or hardening the outside, sort of think of it as an M&M sort of idea, hard on the outside, sort of softer on the inside. But some of the hardening that we've done is obviously reducing the public IP addresses that potentially are, focused in threat areas for folks. We've also implemented a whole bunch of monitoring packages and technology that allows us to sort of see visibility, have that visibility we've talked about a little bit. And we've also, obviously turned off services, hidden to the extent we can, FTP services and those things. And we've also implemented sort of one of our products called AED, which is technology that actually allows us to protect ourselves against DDoS attacks from the sort of the outside, but we also use it to block traffic sort of that is sort of outbound from our network out to the web, and we've sort of clamped down on that, so we've knocked sort of potentially sort of nefarious traffic coming out of our environment. So we've done a lot of work on that. But one of the headlines for us is we've taken over from an IT standpoint and managed the edge in terms of vulnerabilities and sort of put a lot of rigor behind the management of our edge. So that's historically what we've been doing. And as I said, we've been focusing on taking some of those practices and hardening the inside. And this has actually been driven over the last couple of years around supporting our sort of mitigating our risk around ransomware. So a lot of the practices we've implemented there have again really been focused on similar ideas, but I mean, kind of paint a little bit of a picture there. So before I jump into that, do you want me to just keep talking about kind of what we're doing on the inside? I mean, sort of a transition right into some of these other topics, but
I think so, but I wanted to also share with you, we'll get right back to that, Thor. I wanted to share with you our poll results because I think it'll be something for us to discuss. We asked if their organizations are more proactive or reactive when it comes to managing cyber risks, and 70% say proactive, 24% say reactive, and 6% say not sure. What do you make of that?
Well, I mean, I think that's the general trend line. We're, the more proactive you are, the more you're leaning into this problem, the more you're on top of it by, monitoring it and actually securing both the edge and then internally securing that people are being far more, just looking back maybe 3 or 4 years, far more proactive in that. So it doesn't surprise me. And I think we would fit pretty much into that profile as well.
I have 2 questions for our rapid fire round that I want to get to, Thor. Ari spoke about the importance of visibility as a foundation for effective cybersecurity. Can you tell us about the kind of platform you use at NETSCOUT to provide that kind of visibility? And how does it help your teams do their work?
Yeah, so that's what we've done, and what we had actually before we thought about security is we've had for very many years our ability to monitor and from an operating standpoint make sure that our applications, our network, and just overall our environment is as top performing as we have and what we could maximize. So we've been sort of using our technology to make sure that things are running well, if you will, including even end user experience as well as sort of application performance, et cetera. So we've been running that sort of from an operational standpoint. What we've done is over the years is we've now started to use that technology, including sort of packet visibility and inspection, and started to leverage that type of data for our security requirements. And that supports us in a variety of different, very specific ways. So it allows us to sort of watch for lateral movements. It allows us for actually looking for particular protocols that are, sort of high risk protocols that, RDP, for example, or Telnet, and really trying to crack down and minimize the use of those protocols. So there's a lot of things that that sort of visibility supports for a better environment. So we've been doing that, and it also has allowed us to do a far better job of starting to segment our network. And that's that we're in that journey. We're not there yet, but that's also helped us to sort of from a ransomware, particularly from try to minimize or to restrict the access across the network. So we've used our own visibility tools and some incremental products to do a whole set of those sort of services.
Thor, with those kind of capabilities that you just described to us, what would you say are some risk factors that you feel your team has under control. What I'm asking is really, what are the things that are not keeping you up at night anymore?
Well, I think, everything keeps me up at night, so I'm not sure that's a good measure, but I think the big thing we've been able to do, and this kind of goes with another initiative we've been working on and actually have stood up. We now have a pretty active SecOps group, and so let me kind of paint that picture. So we now have sort of eyes on glass, and so one of the things we've done is leverage our own visibility tool and provided that visibility to the SecOps team that is by definition is sort of watching our environment, making sure that, if there's something that we need to investigate, we're investigating. And the point is since we're monitoring that in real time, our response times are far quicker. So our ability now to sort of leverage the moment-to-moment changes of the network to watch our endpoints, watch any sort of odd-looking behaviors that we want to investigate. We're sort of leveraging that infrastructure by having folks actually kind of watch it for us. And so that's has helped, I think, collectively everyone, including me, sort of know that we're, kind of being far more proactive, as we've talked about in the pool survey. And that being proactive leverages that tooling as well as the expertise in our SecOps team. So the combination of that, I think, has really put us in a very different ability to respond and prevent problems from occurring.
Thank you, Thor. I'd like to now open the discussion up to questions from members of the audience. And just a reminder, you can submit them in that box below your video player. We have lots of great questions. So I can't wait to get into it with you and Ari.
So one thing I wanted to say was that while we're waiting is Thor is clearly a good security professional if he stays awake up at night up everything.
Right.
I think that goes without saying.
Security professional. So
yeah.
I have a lot of questions that have come in for you both. So Barry's asking, any thoughts on the liabilities of a critical physical systems connected to the net that might become vulnerable? And how do we protect these life-affecting systems? Ari, that's for you.
Yeah, no, I think this is a challenge that we're all dealing with right now, learning more and more about it. Obviously, if you can disconnect core systems from the internet, that's going to be the best situation for people. But if it is connected, at least it's better to know that it is connected and that you have like just the maximum set of controls you can have on it. It depends on the type of system it is, and I think each of these is sort of an individual case. In talking to some of the manufacturers, I'm not going to mention specific names, but they'll tell us, they'll say that they're all customized, right? So they all have different things to worry about in there. So when you're talking about those kind of ICS systems here that we really have to worry about, industrial control system, that is, we really have to worry about exactly what the risks are and try to do our best to pen it in and get the right controls in place to minimize that risk.
Thank you. Thor, Tariq is asking, this is really for both of you. I'm going to start with you, Thor. Okay. Thor, now that the most organizations have sort of decent level of cybersecurity in place, are you seeing any new trends about the tactics used by threat actors to attack critical infrastructure sectors?
I don't know if they're that new. Clearly the worry that I think we all have as practitioners is, how does it all fit together, and or do we have any sort of gaps in our vulnerabilities? So I think, the one that we're working a lot of, as I talked a little bit, we've been working on a lot of stuff, but one of the things that we've been focused on as well is just the human side of this, and being hyper vigilant with preventing phishing attacks being successful. They come in mainly through email, but there's lots of now new vectors that people are imagining, through text and a variety of other sort of sort of ways of getting into people, trying to reach out and try to, get the click that people want. It's going to install some software. So we've been doing that. I think that's a big sort of trend and another worry that we would all have. We've also started to support, sort of minimizing that. We've implemented a variety of endpoint technologies to prevent sort of installing software, having EDR systems that, to have AI-based behavioral sort of capability. So there's a lot of things that we're trying to do, but I do think the sort of the user, the human now has really been a focus.
Ari, is there anything you wanted to add?
No, I mean, I think Thor got it, a lot of it, but I would say that, a few things that we've seen over the last few years in particular, which won't be a surprise to most of the people listening, but just in case, I think it's good to say again, like the criminals have stopped caring what they're attacking. This started about 5 or 6 years ago when we started to see hospitals get hit, and then schools. It's they don't care, right? We thought some things were off limits. Nothing's off limits anymore. They take pride almost in taking something that's the most valuable offline, because then they can get paid faster. So that, I think we can't really rely on that anymore. In terms of small, medium-sized businesses, the thing that we're seeing the biggest uptake in, which has been going up for years, but it's gotten worse, especially since ransomware sort of like peaked out, leveled out a little bit, is we're starting to see this business email compromise type stuff that goes on all the time, where they'll go after the financial units of small organizations, small companies, small schools. In particular, we're seeing a lot of that now, where they will, use different means, often phishing, sometimes just social engineering, to get information about the company and ask the right questions, and then get money sent to them by changing information that you should need 2 or 3 people to approve. But a lot of these small organizations only have one person that can make the changes to a system to send money. So once the money's sent, it's gone. So.
Ari, I'm going to stay with you for this next question, but Thor, I'm also going to ask it to you. Aaron is asking, in your experience, is there a minimum threshold spending across all sectors that allows companies to do enough in cybersecurity programs?
No, it's different. It's different for different sectors, and I'd say different for different size companies. I mean, you'll even hear, and the way to really test this is talking to the insurance companies, right? And if the insurance companies will ask you, what sector are you in? What's the size of your organization? How much personal information do you have? Right? Those are the questions that they ask first and foremost, and they can give you a general sense based on that alone. We hope that someday the insurance companies will also start really digging in deep on the questions of controls and what controls you have in place, and then giving you discounts based on the fact that you have controls in place. We do see some insurance companies that do that, and some of the specialized cyber insurance companies that do that. But that's really, like, if they can't come up with that, across all different sectors, no one's going to be able to, right? They've looked into this for many years. So I would say those are the main questions to ask, and then the controls that you put in place on top of it.
Thor, did you want to answer that one as well?
Yeah, can you repeat it for me? I just was kind of.
Oh, absolutely. That's not a problem at all. In your experience, Thor, is there a minimum threshold spending across sectors that allows companies to do enough in cybersecurity programs?
I mean, I can't speak to the general industry, but for me, there is. I mean, it's sort of. I mean, it's all based on risk, and so it's hard to sort of cap it. Obviously, there's a practical cap that we all, as CIOs feel pretty much every day, that there's a limit. And I think this is why you go back to risk. I mean, I think if you have clarity over your own company or your industry that's unique, maybe in terms of the risks that you're facing, or as a company, what those risks are, I think that's the focus that will help kind of guide in terms of where you prioritize, what things you prioritize and where you go. But I don't think, there's a cap.
Thank you. Ari, there's a couple of questions for you. Jennifer's asking, how can enterprises meet the new level of regulatory challenges when they are already operationally restricted, right, with the anticipated cybersecurity regulation changes for 2023, along with the layoffs that folks have been seeing?
Yeah, it's going to become challenging for people. And again, I think, we want to see these regulations hit kind of that raise all boats. And so if you're doing enough already, then there's less that you'll have to do specifically there. But that's not all the way that all regulators are going to look at it. Certainly not in the EU. They're going to expect some basic. They're going to try and move the high end higher as well. So I think that we need to. We're going to have to see what that looks like over time. I think that there will be some orientation towards like compliance-based solutions in some areas, just so that people can demonstrate it, and that takes people, right? We've seen that with the banks, where they'll have we're trying to get the banks to in working with some of the bank organizations, we're trying to get to a point where people can do a single audit and then have that demonstrated for a lot of different places. But they still have situations, especially in the US, where they get 6 to 8 audits a quarter. And then they have to do each one of those audits separately, looking at the same stuff. That leads to a lot of compliance workers on staff that have to deal with that. They could be doing security. That money could be going to security alone. And then if you get budget cuts, where does that come from? So I totally understand where she's coming from in this space. And that's one of the reasons we're trying to make these regulations, because there will be more regulations, but the question is, how do we make them most efficient and make the most sense for the different sectors, and don't end up with a situation where you have you need lots of compliance people on staff.
Ari, George is asking, what impact do you think the recent announcement by the government allowing intelligence and law enforcement communities to go on the offensive to sort of hack back the adversaries?
Well, I don't think that I think that it was overstated in the articles that came out there, and talking to the government about it a little bit more, that we haven't seen like a wholesale change towards hackback. It is much more though of the monitoring what's going on and being a little bit more aggressive in figuring out where it's coming from and who's doing it and how to go about getting to it, right? I mean, a lot of times what we see, cyber warfare tends to be pretty asymmetric, where the bad guys can hit us and we have trouble necessarily getting back to them if we're trying to do it through cyber means. But we have other tools that we can use to get to them, that we need to be able to put in place, sanctions being a big one that we use with Russia, et cetera. So I think the question is like, who's doing it? Why are they doing it? What's the best way to get to them? Cyber means isn't always necessarily the best way to get to them. And as I said, I think there is more oversight than some of those articles you've read probably suggest that there is.
This question is for both of you. I'll start with you, Thor. Janet is asking, are end users still the weakest point in the security framework?
The quick answer is yes. This is why we do not only training, but we actually do fairly regular testing of people, the click tests, and unfortunately, our rates vary depending how clever we are in terms of disguising the test routine. Most recently we had one that we used one of our major vendors, and there were a number of people that clicked on it. So, that is really, I think what you have to do as a practitioner is you have to kind of know that that's going to be a weak link and try to provide some layers of protection around that, given that it could happen. So this is where sort of these endpoint technologies really could be very helpful, and including, sort of network while watching, lateral movements and that sort of regimen, I think really supports the riskiest area. But yeah, that's the riskiest one.
Yeah, I would say I agree with that in terms of, it goes back to what I was saying during when you're first asking me questions about this line of the getting people from doing absolutely nothing to getting them to doing the right stuff. If you're on the path to doing the right stuff, then end users are the weakest link. If you've been doing nothing and you're just building a security program, the end users are not necessarily your biggest worry. You still have to worry about them, but you have so many other things to worry about as well. So it's really getting to that point where the end users are the weakest link, that you can start to focus a little bit more on doing the real risk management, where you're bringing down things at the edges rather than for a more mature organization.
Ben has the perfect follow-up to what we're just talking about, which is, how does an organization know that they have enough cybersecurity layers in place? Even with regular pen tests, you can still be missing layers.
Yeah, you can be. I think I think it requires a careful analysis of kind of a pathway for nefarious software entering the environment. You sort of have to have at least one protection layer, maybe even a couple, and you try to make. I think Ari talked about this before. You try to make it hard enough where maybe they they give up and they go not somewhere else, but hopefully they stop. But you try to prevent that as much as you can. So we do that, as I've mentioned a couple of times. We have various layers, both at the endpoint as well as the server level, as well as the cloud level. So we do as much of the redundancy that we think is practical. So and you have to weigh this, practically speaking, with user experience. I mean, obviously, we could make this environment so tight that you couldn't get your job done. So that's always the constant sort of balancing act that we all have to sort of be aware of.
That's a really good point. I'd say, we have people that come to us all the time and say, we want the best red team to come in and make sure that they can't get into our systems. The best red team is getting into your systems at some point. If you're talking about the best in the world, they're getting into your systems. So there's always more you can do, right? But we try to put people off of before you get to that point of having the red team, let's have a blue team go in and make sure all your controls are in place. Let's make sure that, you've done the extra basic tabletop exercises on this, that if you've done that, then we can talk about doing some of the more technical, higher end pen tests, et cetera. And then we can talk about red teaming and figuring out where the edges are, right? So there's this step process to getting to that point where you feel comfortable. Yeah, the best red team's going to get in it, and maybe we'll learn something from the best red team. But if you bring the best red team in before you get to that point, they're going to get in, and you're going to find out about something. But there's still going to be hundreds of more things that you need to do. So you want to get it down to that smaller set of things that is constantly changing. New things on the network that you're learning about, and getting down to that point rather than just looking at at one small area when you need work everywhere.
Ari, I got a couple of questions for you. George is asking, with new regulations and compliance forthcoming, in your perspective, how much teeth will they have regarding really enforcement and fines for companies that fail to comply?
Oh, I think the EU is looking at very heavy fines, and it's a question of enforcement, right? They have a mixed record on enforcement, and it will probably depend on what different countries and how they implement it there in terms of enforcement. But I think the fines, when they do implement, will be very high. In different sectors in the U.S., you're going to see different things, right? We always fall in that way, and that's mostly. I don't think people understand where that comes from. A lot of that is just congressional oversight, right? Congress writes the laws. It's about jurisdiction with the committee that writes the law, right? So one committee might have a really feel something really needs to be done and be able to convince everybody involved, both parties and all the different factions within those parties, to say, oh, we should have high fines in this area. Something bad just happened. We need to find them highly. So you're going to end up with all over the map in terms of different levels of fines and in terms of what needs to be done in different sectors. In the U.S., that's just the way we legislate here. There's some efforts to kind of even that out. I think you'll see that in the national strategy, some discussion of that. that's coming out, and hopefully we can make some progress there, move up some of the sectors that are not doing as much, and have some more cooperation with the sectors where there is too much.
Ari, I want to get to one last question. I think we can make it on time. Connor's asking your thoughts on the NIST AI framework that was published 5 days ago. Will AI help with overall cybersecurity?
Yeah, so I mean, I love this question. I think this is where policy is going in the future. There's a lot of discussion on AI. NIST has a lot of different frameworks, and one of the things they want to do with the cybersecurity framework is map it to these other frameworks. They have a privacy framework. Someone on our team was one of the people that helped to write that. So this all maps together now. You have these different frameworks, and AI is a huge area. There's the pro side of AI for security, and there's the con side of AI. Let me start with the con side, which is the bad guys are using it too, right? Like there's been some experiments already with even Chat GPT where people are like, how do I go about attacking? And we'll give you some advice on how to attack people. So, right, that's just that's the bare minimum of like the kind of AI that could be used on the attacker side. But then on the pro side, right, like we have seen tools that learn, right? And if you can get that kind of visibility we were talking about before, and you can tie an AI engine to it, perhaps a lot more of this becomes automated in the cybersecurity area. So the protections come into place automatically. That would really be a key growth area for us. And I'll say the National Science Foundation has been investing in this back to when I was in government. I mean, like they saw this 20 years ago, like that's the way we're going to get there. And because of that, we have a lot of different efforts in security AI. And I think we're ahead of the attackers in terms of using AI for the good side of it. It's always, the good guys have to be right all the time, and the bad guys only have to be right once to have an impact. So it is hard to, say, right, that we're going to continue to win this battle. But right now, I'm feeling pretty good about automation is moving in a good direction. We're using AI for security purposes.
And that's really a great note for us to end on. I can't believe we're at time. Ari and Thor, thank you for your time. This was really an insightful and interesting conversation, and we really appreciate it.
Great to work with you guys. Hope to do it again.
You too. And also a big thank you to all of you who were watching, attending, and participating in today's event. You asked great questions. The polls were really insightful, so thank you for that. And a big thank you to NETSCOUT for sponsoring this event. You should see a survey link at the top right of the screen when you click on the bell icon for notifications. Please take a moment and share your thoughts. We'd really love to hear from you. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.